She scrubbed floors for a monster who called himself a manager. On Christmas Eve, he threw her into a blizzard and locked the door. She had 45 minutes before her body gave out completely. What she didn't know, what no one told her, was that the man who owned that mansion had just pulled up the security footage. And what he saw on that screen changed everything. If this story has you holding your breath already, stay until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The vase cost more than everything Leora Bennett had ever owned in her entire 19 years of living, and she knew that the second it left her fingers, it didn't shatter so much as explode, the sound cutting through the grand foyer like a gunshot, ceramic shards skidding across 30 feet of polished white marble, catching the light from the chandeliers above and scattering it in 100 cold directions. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the crash itself. It pressed down on the room, on her chest, on every other maid and footman who had gone completely still in their stations along the hallway, not one of them willing to breathe wrong. Leora stood where she had stumbled, her right hand still extended in the shape of something she was no longer holding. The loose strand of silver garland lay across the floor where it had caught her foot. She hadn't even seen it. 3 hours of careful, meticulous work moving through this house like she was made of shadow and apology. And she'd been brought down by a piece of Christmas decoration she could have bought at any drugstore for $3. She dropped to her knees. Her hands were already moving, reaching for the pieces, as though she could reassemble the thing through willpower and desperation alone. The porcelain was cold under her fingers. Hand-painted detailing, she noticed even now. Blue and ivory figures along the body of the vase. Some Italian pastoral scene she would never be able to identify. The neck had broken clean. The base had exploded into 7 or 8 jagged pieces. "Stand up." The voice came from the far end of the foyer, quiet and precise in a way that made it worse than any shout. Leora's hands stopped moving. She stood. Victor Hawthorne was not a physically imposing man. He stood maybe 5'10" in his polished shoes, slight through the shoulders, with a face that stayed carefully neutral the way a surgeon's might during a procedure. He was 51 years old and had managed the DeLuca estate for 11 years. And in those 11 years, he had developed a way of moving through a room that made the air feel different, thinner, colder, deliberately unwelcoming. He dressed in charcoal and dark navy exclusively. He kept his silver-streaked hair combed back from his forehead with enough product that it never moved. His eyes were a pale, washed-out gray that Leora had privately compared, in her own head, to old dishwater. He walked toward her slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. The other staff disappeared. Not physically. They were still at their stations, still holding their garlands and their polish cloths and their silver trays, but they'd gone somewhere unreachable inside themselves. The practiced disappearing act of people who had learned that witnessing Victor Hawthorne's displeasure too openly had a cost. He stopped 3 feet from her. He looked at the shards on the floor, then at her face, then at the shards again. "Do you know what that was?" "Yes, sir. I'm so sorry. The garland caught my—" "Do you know what that was?" Not a question this time. Leora closed her mouth. Her throat felt like it had something lodged in it. "That," Victor said, his voice still precisely calibrated, still completely controlled, "was a Ginori porcelain urn circa 1887. It has been in this foyer for 6 years. It was a gift from a Florentine collector to Mr. DeLuca's late mother. There are 3 others like it in private collections in Europe, and 1 in a museum in Milan." He paused. "There will never be another one purchased to replace it, because the man who made it died in 1923, and there is no replacing what is gone." "I understand," she said. Whatever it costs, whatever I can." "You'll what?" For the first time, something moved behind those washed-out eyes. Not anger exactly, closer to contempt. "You make $11 an hour, Miss Bennett. You've been employed here for 3 months. Even if we docked your entire salary for the remainder of your natural life, you wouldn't come close." She knew that. She'd known it from the second the vase hit the floor. "I'm truly sorry," she said. The words felt hollow, which they were, because there was nothing adequate to put in their place. Victor studied her for a long moment, with the expression of a man deciding which drawer to put something in. "Collect your coat," he said. "Sir?" "Your coat. Your bag. Whatever personal items you've left in the staff quarters. You have 15 minutes. The room had gone genuinely silent now. Even the wind against the tall windows seemed to be holding itself back. "Mr. Hawthorne?" She heard her own voice and thought it sounded very young. "It's Christmas Eve. The last train to the city left 2 hours ago. I checked. There's the storm. That is not my concern. The highway is closed. They announced it this afternoon. There's a travel advisory. Miss Bennett," he straightened the cuff of his jacket. "I don't have a habit of repeating myself. You have destroyed an irreplaceable piece of this family's history on the most significant evening of the year. There are 200 guests arriving in 4 hours. This estate represents Mr. DeLuca's home and his legacy, and I will not have the person responsible for tonight's most significant failure standing in it when those guests walk through the door." He looked at her without cruelty, but without a single trace of mercy. 15 minutes. She wanted to say something else. She could feel the words trying to form, reasonable words, words about the temperature outside, and the travel advisory, and the fact that a woman sent out into a blizzard in a thin servant's jacket with no car and nowhere to go was not a minor administrative inconvenience, but something several degrees more serious. But she'd worked in enough houses, enough situations, enough corners of other people's lives to understand the exact moment when reason stopped mattering to the person in front of you. Victor had already decided. The conversation was a formality he was performing out of habit. She went to collect her things. The staff quarters were on the 3rd floor, tucked behind the house's east wing, where the architecture went from grand to purely functional. Fluorescent lighting, linoleum floors, hollow doors that didn't quite seal against sound. Her room was the smallest of the 6 available, a converted storage space really, but she'd made it hers in the way people do when they don't have options. A photograph of her parents on the narrow shelf above the bed, taken the summer before the accident, her mother squinting against the sun and laughing at something off-frame, her father's arm around her shoulders. A library book on the bedside table, half finished. The flannel blanket she'd owned since she was 14, washed until it was almost transparent. She put the photograph in her bag. The blanket. Her second pair of shoes, the change of clothes, the few toiletries she owned. She did not cry. She'd made a decision about crying somewhere around the time she turned 16, and the 3rd foster placement in 2 years had ended badly, a decision that her tears were something she would spend privately or not at all. There were limits to what she'd perform for an audience. She put on her work jacket, the thin navy one with the estate's crest stitched on the breast pocket, because it was all she had. Her actual winter coat was at the dry cleaner in town, dropped off 3 days ago before the forecast had turned apocalyptic. She'd planned to pick it up tomorrow. Tomorrow seemed like a concept from a different country now. She came back down the main staircase at 13 minutes. Victor was waiting in the foyer, standing near the front entrance, with his hands still behind his back, as though he'd spent the entire time in exactly this position. The front doors were 12 feet tall, solid oak with brass fittings, and when Victor opened them, the cold came in like a physical body slamming through the gap. The wind had escalated since she'd last been outside, which had been 6 hours ago, which had been before any of this. The blizzard had stopped being a weather event and become something closer to a landscape, a whiteout world that reduced the estate's floodlit grounds to a smear of gray and silver beyond the stone steps. Leora stood in the doorway and looked at it. "Mr. Hawthorne." Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "I'm asking you to reconsider. Not for my sake. I understand you're angry, and I understand the vase is—" "I'm not angry," he said, which was true, and somehow worse for it. Then as a practical matter, the temperature is below 0. I don't have a winter coat. The gate is half a mile from the house, and I have no way to get further than that, even if I reach it. I'm asking for the utility room, or the garage, or anywhere I can wait until morning when I can. The gate code has already been changed," Victor said. He reached past her and pushed the door open wider. She stared at him. There was a moment. She would think about this moment afterward, in the days and weeks that followed, turning it over like something she'd found on the ground and wasn't sure what to do with. A moment where she looked at his face and tried to find something in it. Not mercy. Not at this point. Just recognition. The basic acknowledgement that she was a person standing in front of him, 19 years old, with a library book and a photograph and a flannel blanket and no coat, and that what was happening was not a routine personnel decision. That it was, depending on how the next few hours went, something else entirely. She didn't find it. She walked out the door. The cold hit her with the indifference of something that didn't know she existed and wouldn't have cared if it did. It was the kind of cold that moved through fabric like fabric wasn't there, that went directly for joints and extremities and the thin-skinned places at the sides of the throat. The wind had a horizontal quality to it, driving snow directly into her face before she'd cleared the top step. She heard the doors close behind her. She heard the lock engage. She stood on the top step for a moment with her bag over her shoulder and the wind roaring around the corners of the mansion and the snow building on the granite balustrade beside her, and she thought, all right. Half a mile to the gate. There might be a call box. There might be a road with traffic on it beyond the gate. Though the highway closure announcement had covered the main artery, she wasn't sure about the county road that ran along the property. Either way, half a mile. She'd walked further than that in worse conditions. She hadn't, actually, but she decided to believe it anyway. She started down the steps. The DeLuca estate was set on about 40 acres of Hudson Valley property. The main house centered in the middle of it, the grounds professionally maintained in a way that had always struck her as excessive. Topiaries and stone paths, and a reflecting pool currently buried under 3 feet of snow. Ornamental gardens that extended out from the east and west wings in formal arrangements she'd never had occasion to properly see in daylight because she was always inside them. The drive was a long curve from the house to the gate, lined with trees that were now shapeless white columns in the dark. She followed the drive because it was the most logical path. The trees blocked some of the wind. The snow was packed enough along the center of the lane that she could make progress, though her thin shoes soaked through within the first 100 yards, and she stopped registering her feet as separate from the cold more or less immediately after that. She counted her steps. This was a trick she'd developed somewhere in childhood, when the foster care system had required her to navigate situations that were too large and overwhelming to process as a whole. She'd broken them into units, steps, minutes, small countable things. It gave the brain something to do besides panic. She made it past the reflecting pool, which she identified only by the shape of the surrounding hedge barely visible above the snow. She made it past the garden fork, the place where the east path split off toward the greenhouse. She could see the vague darkness of the tree line marking the property's edge to her left, which meant she was roughly a third of the way to the gate. Maybe a little more. The snow was mid-calf now, and deeper in places where it had drifted. Her bag had gotten heavy with snowmelt. The photograph of her parents was in a paper envelope inside the bag, and she found herself thinking, irrationally but persistently, about the photograph getting wet. About her mother's face in that picture, the squinting laugh, the off-frame thing that had made her laugh. Her mother had laughed at a lot of things. It had been one of her dominant characteristics. The laugh. Loud enough to be occasionally embarrassing, real enough that you forgot to be embarrassed. She stopped counting steps somewhere past the halfway point. Her thoughts had started doing something strange, sliding sideways from the immediate problem, which was the cold and the distance remaining, into other things. The feeling had changed. It had moved from discomfort, which was manageable, through pain, which was not, and into something on the other side of pain that she didn't have a clean word for. Her hands had stopped being cold and started being absent. She was aware of them as objects she was attached to, but not as parts of herself she was currently operating. She tried to make a fist. The feedback was delayed by several seconds. That was not good. She knew it wasn't good, and she kept walking, and she told herself, with the particular stubbornness that had gotten her through the 3 years since her parents' car accident and the foster placements and the aging out and the scramble for anything that would keep her fed and housed, she told herself that stopping was not an option. She'd gotten herself out of worse situations. She was going to get out of this one. But her body was beginning to disagree with her about what constituted an option. She was moving at maybe half the pace she'd started with. The gate lights were visible now, barely, a smear of amber through the white. 200 yards, maybe 250. She tried to calculate how long that would take her at her current speed and couldn't hold the numbers in her head long enough to complete the calculation. Her right knee buckled on a patch of ice under the snow, and she went down hard, one hand out to catch herself, palm scraping across the frozen ground. She stayed on her knees for a moment. The wind had dropped slightly, or possibly she'd just lost the ability to register it as acutely. The ancient pine tree was to her left, one of the estate's original trees, enormous and old, its lower branches creating a kind of canopy above the snow, a dark space under the spread of its limbs where the drifts were shallower. She'd passed it dozens of times in her months at the estate. It looked different now. It looked like an option. She wasn't sure when she made the decision, or if she made it. She was under the tree. Her back was against the trunk. The snow was only ankle deep here, and the wind was partially blocked by the branches above, and she had stopped shivering, which she understood enough to know was a bad sign rather than a good one. Shivering was the body working. Shivering stopping meant the body was making different decisions. She pulled her bag against her chest. She thought about the photograph. She thought about her mother's laugh, the specific pitch of it, the way it had filled rooms. She thought about the library book on the shelf in a room she was never going back to. Her eyes were very heavy. The last coherent thought she had was that she was annoyed, genuinely, cleanly, specifically annoyed, that this was how it ended. Not in any of the 100 genuinely dangerous situations she'd navigated in the 3 years since everything fell apart. Here, 20 feet from the main drive of a billionaire's estate on Christmas Eve, because a man in a charcoal suit had decided a piece of porcelain was worth more than her life. The annoyance kept her eyes open for approximately 45 more seconds. Then the cold took that too. She didn't hear the sound of vehicles coming up the estate road, the deep, even rumble of multiple engines, the crunch of heavy tires on snow. She didn't see the sweep of headlights through the blizzard as the black SUV convoy turned off the county road and proceeded through the gate, which had opened automatically ahead of them. She didn't see the way the lead vehicle's lights caught the edge of the tree canopy as it passed. She didn't see any of it. Inside the first vehicle, Kyle DeLuca sat in the rear passenger seat and watched the estate's lights emerge from the storm as the convoy approached the main house, and he rolled his neck and thought about nothing in particular, which was about as close to peace as he ever got anymore. He was 34 years old and looked it in some ways and didn't in others. The suit was what you noticed first. Charcoal, bespoke, the kind of fit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. But the suit existed in deliberate tension with the rest of him, the way his jaw sat, the particular alertness behind his eyes, the hands. His hands were not the hands of a man who'd made his money at a desk. There were 2 scars on his right hand, one crossing the knuckle of his index finger, one at the base of his thumb, both old enough to be unremarkable if you weren't the kind of person who looked for these things. The people in his professional life were, almost universally, the kind of people who looked for these things. The DeLuca name in legitimate circles meant construction, real estate, a logistics company that operated out of 3 Northeast states. In the other circles, the ones that didn't appear on any corporate registration, the DeLuca name meant something else. Something that had been built over 30 years by Kyle's father, and then, over the past 6 years, maintained and expanded and quietly transformed by Kyle himself. The organization he ran was not what his father's had been. It was more controlled, more strategic, more selective, less blood for the sake of blood, more calculation. He'd lost something in the transition, his father's generation told him. The fear, they said, was different when you were ruthless about everything versus ruthless about the right things. Kyle considered this a misunderstanding of effective management. The meeting in Albany had run 6 hours longer than planned. He was tired in the way that came from 6 hours of controlled performance, maintaining the right face in front of men who were always measuring whether that face was the true one, and he was looking forward to the specific quiet of his study, the specific weight of the first glass of whiskey after a day that required him to be entirely impenetrable. He also needed coffee. This was not an insignificant thing. 3 months ago, he had noticed, without particularly registering it as something to notice, that the maid who brought his evening coffee had changed. The previous girl had been adequate, the coffee acceptable. The new one, he'd read the intake sheet when Victor had flagged a new hire, as he did with all of them. The new one was 19, named Lyora Bennett, no local connections, came from the city's foster care pipeline, references from 2 previous households, both of which had praised her work ethic in language that was notably warmer than the standard. He'd filed this away with all the other staffing information and not thought about it again. Then at 7 o'clock that first evening, he'd been in his study deep in the kind of document work that required full concentration, and she'd come in, and the coffee had been Ethiopian blend, his preference, which he had not specified to anyone that week, which meant she'd looked it up. The cup had been placed in his peripheral vision at exactly the right distance, close enough to reach without looking, far enough not to be intrusive. She'd left without speaking. He'd noticed. In the weeks that followed, he'd continued to notice in the way he noticed most things, passively, retaining more than he indicated, building a picture without intending to. She was quiet without being servile. She did the work without requiring acknowledgement of it. When he had on 3 occasions been in the study before 7 and she'd come in and found him occupied, she'd placed the coffee and left without the particular performing invisibility quality that some of the staff developed, the anxious non-presence of people trying too hard to be unnoticed. She was just there, and then gone, like a thing that belonged exactly where it was. He'd found it restful, in the way that some people were restful. He hadn't examined it further. Now, as the convoy pulled up to the main entrance, what he noticed was the absence. He was aware of it before the car had fully stopped. A low-register wrongness, the kind that didn't announce itself through specific information, but through the gap where specific information should have been. He checked his watch. 9:47. He'd missed the 7 o'clock by nearly 3 hours. There would have been no coffee. He'd known that during the meeting, had accounted for it, had not been particularly concerned. What he was responding to now was something else. He stepped out of the car and felt the cold of the storm hit him with its full force, and didn't particularly flinch from it. He'd grown up in a house where weakness was a thing that happened to other people, and the cold had never significantly registered. And he walked up the stone steps while the driver and the 2 security personnel who'd traveled with him followed at the appropriate distance. Victor met him in the foyer. "Welcome home, Mr. DeLuca. I hope the meeting concluded satisfactorily." Victor had the ability to say things like this and make them sound like something other than warmth. Not cold exactly, just precisely calibrated, like a temperature that was exactly what it needed to be, and not 1 degree more. "Where's Bennett?" Kyle said. Victor's expression didn't change in any visible way, but something shifted in it, in a register that was almost imperceptible. Almost. Kyle had built his career on the almost imperceptible. "Miss Bennett isn't available this evening," Victor said. "She left early. On Christmas Eve in a blizzard. A family matter. I believe she arranged transportation." Kyle looked at him. Just looked. He'd developed this as a technique a long time ago. Not staring, not aggressive, just the application of full, patient attention in a way that most people found deeply uncomfortable because they didn't know what to do with being fully attended to. "Show me the security footage from the last 3 hours," he said. Victor's expression remained unchanged. "I'm sure that won't be necessary. I didn't ask you whether it was necessary." There was a pause. Around them, the foyer held itself very still. The 2 bodyguards, the domestic staff who'd been present for the arrival, everyone finding something to look at that wasn't this conversation. "Of course," Victor said. The security room was off the west corridor, a dedicated space with 16 monitors covering the estate's exterior and interior common areas. Kyle sat at the central console while the system pulled the evening's recording, and he started it from 3 hours back and moved through it at 4 times speed. He found the foyer footage at the 22-minute mark. He watched the vase fall. He watched Leora drop to her knees and reach for the pieces. He watched Victor cross the room. He watched the conversation that followed. Couldn't hear it, but he'd spent enough years reading body language in rooms full of people trying to hide things to read this one clearly. He watched her go upstairs. He watched her come back down. He watched Victor walk her to the front door. He watched Victor open it. He watched the storm outside. He watched Leora stand in the doorway for a moment, her bag over her shoulder, her work jacket. The thin one, he recognized it, the estate-issue jacket that none of them wore outside in winter because it wasn't designed for it. And he watched her say something to Victor, and he watched Victor's body language, the lack of movement in it, the closed quality. He watched her walk out into the blizzard. He watched the doors close. He looked at the timestamp, 8:43. He looked at the current time on the monitor display, 9:51, 68 minutes. He sat with this for approximately 5 seconds. Then he stood. "Get me the thermal gear from the equipment room," he said to neither bodyguard in particular, his voice carrying the specific flat quality it sometimes had in professional contexts when the outcome of a situation had already been determined and the only remaining variable was logistics. The Gore-Tex jacket, the gloves, the boots in the left cabinet. Now. He looked at Victor. Victor was standing in the doorway of the security room, and for the first time in 11 years of employment, Kyle looked at his face and saw something that was not careful control. It was small, it was barely visible, but it was there. "You want to say something," Kyle said. Victor said nothing. "Then don't." The bodyguard came back with the gear. Kyle dressed in approximately 90 seconds, jacket, gloves, boots, pulling each thing on with the focused efficiency of a man who had, in other contexts, needed to move quickly and not wasted time thinking about it. He took the flashlight from the equipment room shelf. He took the thermal blanket from the emergency kit. "Nobody leaves this house," he said to the room in general. He went out the front door. The storm was at its full violence now. Wind in the mid-30s, gusting higher, the snow coming not in flakes but in dense horizontal sheets that reduced visibility to maybe 15 feet ahead. He turned on the flashlight and aimed it forward and moved down the drive at a pace that was deliberately controlled, fast but not panicked, covering ground efficiently rather than burning out trying to run through snow that resisted running. He was not a man who panicked. He'd operated in situations where panic was the natural response and had trained it out of himself at considerable cost. But there was something underneath the operational focus now, something that he wasn't entirely familiar with and didn't have clean language for, something that had to do with the timestamp on the security footage and the image of that thin navy jacket and 68 minutes of his property's driveway in 0-degree weather. And it was driving his pace in a way that was not entirely rational and that he made no move to suppress. He moved through the storm for 7 minutes before the flashlight caught the edge of the pine tree's canopy. He almost missed her. She was against the trunk with her bag pulled against her chest, and her head slightly to one side, and she was the same color as the snow, or near enough that his flashlight had passed over the spot twice before something made him sweep back to it. He came around the edge of the canopy and dropped to one knee in front of her and put 2 fingers against the side of her throat. The pulse was there. It was not strong. Her lips had a bluish cast to them. Her skin was cold in the particular way that meant more than just surface cold. Her hands around the bag were locked in a grip that wasn't entirely conscious anymore. He wrapped the thermal blanket around her shoulders first, then her whole body, tucking it under her in the snow. Then he put his arms under her, one beneath her knees, one behind her shoulders, and stood, which required effort because she was dead weight, and the snow shifted under his boots, and he was managing the flashlight at the same time. But he managed it because there was no version of this where he put her down. He carried her back through the blizzard. The walk out had taken 7 minutes. The walk back carrying her took nearly 20. The storm didn't care. The storm was indifferent in the way that enormous things are indifferent. Not hostile, just absent any awareness that she existed or that what happened to her mattered. Kyle was aware that he was talking to her, quietly, not loudly enough to be heard over the wind, but talking anyway, the words less important than the continuity of them. "Stay with me" was in there somewhere. "It's not far." "You're going to be fine" was a lie, but he said it anyway with the particular conviction of a man who intended to make it true. The lights of the house appeared through the storm. He came up the drive at a jog, the last 100 yards, her weight across his arms and the thermal blanket catching the wind and his own breathing hard from the cold and the effort. He came through the front door. Victor was standing in the foyer, exactly where Kyle had left him, and for one moment Kyle looked at the man's face over the bundle of Lyora Bennett in his arms. And what passed between them in that look was not a conversation and not a threat and not a promise. It was something that required none of those formats to communicate perfectly. "Get Dr. Chen," Kale said to the nearest person. "Tell her it's hypothermia. Have her meet us in the East guest suite." He carried Leora up the main staircase. Behind him, the party preparations for the most prestigious gala on the estate's social calendar continued in the rooms below. Caterers in the kitchen, florists in the dining room, 200 guests scheduled to arrive in 3 hours for the event. Victor had declared required absolute perfection. Kale did not think about the gala once. He thought about a pulse that had been there but not strong enough, about lips that were the wrong color, about 68 minutes in the dark at the base of a tree. He thought about a girl who'd brought him coffee every evening for 3 months without asking for recognition and who had received, in exchange, a man with a charcoal suit deciding she was less valuable than a piece of porcelain. He settled her on his bed in the East guest suite and pulled the thermal blanket back to check her color and found it slightly better than it had been, which was something. Her hands were still locked around the bag. He worked them loose, gently, and put the bag on the chair beside the bed. The pulse was still there. Dr. Chen arrived 4 minutes later, the estate's private physician, on retainer, who had learned over the years that when she received a call like the one she'd just received, moving quickly was not optional. She brought the kind of calm that very good doctors had, the kind that didn't feel like the absence of emotion, but like emotion organized into something useful. She worked while Kael stood at the window and watched the storm outside. And outside, the storm continued exactly as it had without him. And after a while, he heard Dr. Chen say, "She's going to be okay, Kael. She got very lucky with the timing." He didn't say anything. "She's going to need to stay warm and monitored through the night," Chen continued. "Her core temperature's low, but not critically. The hands are the main concern. Some frost nip, possible early frostbite on the right ring finger. We'll know more in the morning. She needs fluids when she wakes up. She may be disoriented." "Okay," he said. Chen looked at him with the particular expression of someone who had known him for a long time and had opinions she generally kept to herself. "The gala. Deal with it," he said, which was vague, which was intentional. Chen nodded once and left. Cale pulled the chair away from the desk and set it beside the bed and sat in it, and he looked at Leora Bennett's face, the color coming back into it now, slowly, the blue leaving her lips. And he thought about nothing in particular, which he was very rarely able to do. And he sat there while 2 floors below him a $100,000 Christmas Eve gala began without its host, and the storm outside raged at the windows, and the estate waited to see what would happen next. He was still there when she opened her eyes. She looked at him. Her expression moved through several things quickly. Confusion first, then recognition, then the specific bracing quality of someone preparing for a verdict they're expecting to be bad. She started to sit up. "Don't," he said. "You've been out for a while." She stopped. She looked at the room, the guest suite, not the staff quarters, not anywhere she'd been before, and then back at him. And he watched her trying to assemble the sequence of events from what was available to her. "Mr. DeLuca," she said. Her voice was rough. "Yeah. I broke the vase." He looked at her for a moment. "I know," he said. She waited. "A vase can be replaced," he said. "A person can't." The words landed differently than he'd intended. He'd meant them as a straightforward statement of fact, the kind of pragmatic framing he'd applied to resource questions his entire professional life. But something in her face shifted when he said them, something that moved under the surface and then was still again. And he filed it away without comment and let the silence settle. Outside the window, the storm was beginning to ease. Below them, he could hear the faint sound of the gala's music. Something classical, professionally performed, exactly as planned. He stayed in the chair. She didn't tell him to leave. What neither of them could have known, in that quiet room with the storm outside and the music below, and the space between them, was that Victor Hawthorne was not going to disappear quietly. That a man who'd spent 11 years building authority through fear was not going to accept its sudden collapse without looking for a way to turn it into something else. That Leora Bennett, lying in a guest room she'd never expected to be inside, was not nearly as safe as the locked front door and the retreating blizzard made her feel. But that was a problem for a world that had not arrived yet. For now, there was only this room, and 2 people who had each, in very different ways, spent a long time learning not to need anything from anyone, sitting in the particular silence of a night that had gone wrong in every possible direction, and then, improbably, not ended the way it should have. The storm pulled back from the windows. The house held its breath. She woke up at 4 in the morning with her right hand burning, not the cold kind of burning, the other kind, the deep cellular kind that meant the nerves were coming back online after being somewhere they weren't supposed to be, reasserting themselves with the particular cruelty of things returning from damage. She lay in the unfamiliar dark and didn't move for several seconds, cataloging what she had access to. The hand, the ceiling, the sound of wind that had dropped from a roar to something negotiable, the smell of the room, which was expensive in a quiet way. Not perfume, not cleaning products, just the particular smell of a space that had never needed to be cheap. The chair beside the bed was empty. She didn't know when he'd left. She had a fragmented memory of waking once before, sometime in the deep middle of the night. And there had been a woman. The doctor, she understood now, pressing 2 fingers to her wrist and writing something down. And beyond that woman, at the edge of her vision, The chair had still been occupied. She'd gone back under before she could be certain. Now the chair was empty and the room was dark, and she needed water badly enough that it moved to the front of everything else. There was a glass on the bedside table. She reached for it with her left hand, which worked normally. Her right hand she kept still, watching it with the particular cautious attention you give a thing that has recently surprised you with its capacity for betrayal. She drank half the glass. She looked at the room properly for the first time. The East Guest Suite. She knew this room by reputation, had cleaned it twice in her 3 months at the estate, had changed the linens once after a guest departure, and noted, without letting herself feel too much about it, that this was a nicer room than anywhere she'd ever slept. Crown molding. A fireplace that was currently producing low, steady heat from what appeared to be a real fire banked for the night. Curtains that were heavy enough to suggest the windows behind them were large. Furniture that had been chosen by someone with taste rather than someone trying to signal taste, which was a distinction that mattered. She thought about the photograph in her bag. She looked at the chair beside the bed and found the bag on the floor next to it. She exhaled. She sat up carefully, testing each thing as she went. Her feet were sore in a way that was going to be worse tomorrow, and the joints of her ankles had a deep ache that she recognized from the one winter she'd spent initiated in inadequate footwear working an outdoor job. Her right hand was pink-red along the fingers, slightly swollen. The ring finger had a white patch at the tip that she touched carefully and found partially numb, which was unpleasant, but not the worst version of what that could have been. She was alive. She sat with this for a moment, not dramatically, just noting it as a fact. She was alive in a warm room with a fire and a glass of water, and her mother's photograph intact in the bag 3 feet away. She had been a different version of alive a few hours ago, the kind where the gap between the current state and a different one is very small and getting smaller. And now she was here, and the storm outside had settled into something that sounded manageable. And she was going to need to think very carefully about what came next. What came next began at 7:15 when the door opened. She expected the doctor. She was still in the bed, hadn't tried to do anything as ambitious as standing yet, and she pulled the blanket up in the automatic response of a person who had spent years in situations where being caught resting was potentially a problem. Then she registered who was in the doorway, and the automatic response stopped being useful. Kael DeLuca was dressed differently than she'd ever seen him. Not the suit, which was the only version of him she'd had access to, but dark trousers and a gray shirt with the sleeves pushed up and no jacket, and he looked like someone who hadn't slept and had not particularly tried to. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee, which under any other circumstances would have been the detail she focused on, but what she actually focused on was the expression on his face, which was the expression of a man who had been thinking about something for several hours and had reached conclusions he was now prepared to act on. He set 1 cup on the bedside table. "How's the hand?" he said. "It'll be okay." She looked at the coffee. "You didn't have to. You've been bringing me coffee every evening for 3 months. Figure the debt runs both directions." He sat in the chair. He picked up his own cup and didn't drink from it immediately, just held it. "Chen will be back at 9. She wants to look at the finger." "I can be out of your way before—" "You're not in my way." The directness of it stopped her. He looked at her steadily. "I watched the footage, Leora." She registered that he'd used her first name. He had not done this before. She wasn't certain he'd had occasion to use her name at all in 3 months of 7 o'clock coffee. "Okay," she said carefully. "I need you to tell me if there's anything else. Anything Victor did or said that I didn't see on the recording. Anything that happened before tonight that you think I should know about." She considered this. The honest answer was yes. There were things. The way Victor ran the staff through a particular kind of managed dread. The roster she'd quietly observed over 3 months. The 2 previous maids who'd left in her first month under circumstances she'd never had fully explained. The way he moved through the household like something between an administrator and a threat. But there was a version of this conversation where she laid out everything she'd observed and noticed and stored away over 3 months of paying careful attention, and the version where she said some of it and held back the rest, and the version where she said almost nothing. 3 months of working for a man she'd only ever seen in rooms full of other people. A man whose name she had since learned, when she'd finally done the research she probably should have done before taking the position, was attached to things that existed well outside the boundaries of real estate and logistics. She made a choice. "He's done this before," she said. "Not the storm. Not exactly this, but he's removed staff under conditions where they didn't have somewhere to go. The girl before me, Petra, I think, she'd been here 7 months. She was gone in a week after she started asking about pay discrepancies. I don't know where she went. No one would tell me. Cale was watching her with the kind of attention that she was beginning to understand was not incidental. Anyone else? A groundskeeper named Emilio. He got into it with Victor about the chemicals they were using in the greenhouse, something about one of them not being properly licensed for residential properties. He disappeared on a Tuesday, and by Thursday someone new had his room. How long ago? Maybe 6 weeks before I started. Maria told me about it. Maria Alvarez, she's the senior housekeeper. I know who Maria is. She picked up the coffee and drank from it, and it was objectively exactly right. Ethiopian, the specific blend, the right temperature. And she had a brief disorienting moment of wondering whether he'd made it himself or whether someone else in this household at 7 in the morning had known to make it this way. You knew to make it right, she said, before she decided to. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't quite a smile. It was something adjacent to one, a recognition, maybe, of a small thing that had been noticed. You look it up in the first week, he said. The preferences. I thought you looked it up. Third day. I asked Maria. She had the whole thing memorized. He nodded once. Then he said, Victor is no longer employed here. I'm calling it official at 9 o'clock, which is when the lawyers open. I'll have the paperwork done by noon. He said it the way he said most things. Flat, no particular color to it, as though it were not the part of the situation that required emphasis. You're staying in this room until Chen clears you. When she does, I'd like you to consider staying on in a different capacity. She looked at him. Maria has been the senior housekeeper here for 9 years, he said. She should have been managing this estate for at least 3 of them. That changes today. I need someone in the assistant manager role while she gets oriented to the scope. Someone who pays attention and keeps track of things. He paused. Your salary triples, and the guest wing on this floor is yours until you decide you want something else. The offer sat between them. Leora felt the particular discomfort of something being given to her that was larger than she'd been prepared for. Not the discomfort of not wanting it, but the discomfort of wanting it and not trusting the wanting. She'd had enough experience of good things that turned into obligations that carried costs she hadn't anticipated. Why? She said. He didn't deflect the question. Because I looked at the footage and I didn't like what I saw. And because I know what Maria is capable of, and she's been underused for years because Victor didn't want someone competent next to him who might see what he was doing. He drank his coffee. And because you went out into that blizzard rather than make a scene in my foyer, and I want to understand better what kind of person does that. She was quiet for a moment. Someone who's been in enough situations where making a scene costs more than the alternative. Yeah, he said, that's what I figured. The morning came in properly after that. Dr. Chen returned at 9 and confirmed what Leora had already assessed. The hand was frost nip rather than true frostbite. The ring finger needed to be monitored but should recover fully. The ankle soreness would resolve in a few days. She wrote down instructions and left them on the bedside table with the particular efficiency of someone who had limited patience for people who didn't follow instructions. Victor's termination was handled with the same efficiency that Kael appeared to apply to everything that needed to be resolved. At 9:45, Leora heard raised voices through the floor. She was still in the guest suite following instructions, which she was very capable of doing when the instructions made sense. And she recognized Victor's voice in them, controlled at first, precise, and then less so as the conversation progressed, the precision giving way to something tighter and higher. She couldn't make out words. She didn't need to. At 10:30, a car left the property. At 11, Kael knocked on the guest suite door and came in, and he looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read because it occupied a register she wasn't experienced with. Not professional satisfaction exactly, closer to a thing resolved, a thing no longer requiring management. Done? She said. Done. She nodded. He'll try to come back, she said. Not today? Not soon. But people like that they don't absorb it. They redirect it. Kael was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. I've met a lot of people like that. She imagined, without saying anything, that this was probably true. The household gathered at noon. Kyle did it himself, not through an announcement delivered by intermediary, not through a memo, but in person, in the grand hall, with every member of the estate staff present: housekeepers, groundskeepers, kitchen staff, security personnel, personal assistants. He stood at the center of the hall where he didn't normally stand, and he was quiet for a moment before he spoke. And the quiet had the quality of a thing you paid attention to. He told them what had happened, not everything. He was precise about what he included and what he omitted, but the shape of it. A staff member had been sent into a blizzard. The security footage had been reviewed. Victor Hawthorne was no longer employed on this estate and would not be returning. Maria Alvarez was the new estate manager, effective immediately. Leora Bennett was the assistant manager when she was ready to take the role. He said, "Anyone who has experienced anything in this household that they didn't feel able to report through the existing channels can speak to me directly or to Maria. That's not a performance. It's an open door." He said, "What happened last night doesn't happen in my house. Not to anyone." Then he left. Leora, standing at the back of the hall because she'd come down against Chen's instructions because she needed to see this, watched the staff absorb what had just happened. She watched it move through the room. The housekeepers who'd been here longer than she had, whose faces carried the specific expression of people who had learned not to show what they felt in a given space and were now recalibrating whether that was still necessary. She watched Marco, one of the groundskeepers, exhale a breath that had probably been building for some time. She watched Maria, standing near the front, hold herself with a stillness that wasn't the absence of feeling, but the management of more of it than could be displayed in this room. After the hall cleared, Maria found her. Maria Alvarez was 53 years old and had the particular quality of a woman who had absorbed a great deal of difficulty without being diminished by it. She was small, several inches shorter than Leora, and had gray at the temples and lines at the corners of her eyes that came from squinting rather than from sadness. She put her hands on Leora's shoulders, which was the first time anyone had touched her with straightforward warmth in longer than she wanted to count. "You scared me," Maria said. "When I found out. This morning." "I'm okay." "I know you are. You're stubborn enough to be okay." Maria looked at her steadily. "How's the hand?" "Going to be fine." Maria nodded. "He sat with you all night," she said. "In case you were wondering. I came up at midnight and he was still in that chair." Leora didn't say anything. "That's not something he does," Maria said. "I want you to understand. That man doesn't... He manages things. He doesn't sit with them." She let that land, and then she went to find the kitchen staff about lunch, because Maria was a woman who communicated what needed to be communicated and then moved on. And Leora stood in the hall alone for a moment with the information and turned it over and didn't entirely know what to do with it, and ultimately decided she didn't need to do anything with it right now. She went back upstairs, following instructions. The weeks that followed had their own rhythm. Winter settled over the estate with the particular stillness of a season that had spent its violence and was now simply present. The gala cleanup took 3 days. New Year's came and went, a smaller affair, family members and a handful of close associates, nothing that required the full apparatus. By the middle of January, the house was running at the pace of a thing that had been recalibrated, quieter, steadier, with the particular atmospheric change that occurred when the specific quality of a manager's fear was removed from a household's operation. Maria worked with the thoroughness of someone who had been waiting for the scope for years and had spent that time preparing without knowing she was preparing. She didn't need much from Leora beyond what Leora was already good at: tracking, noticing, staying a problem ahead of the problem. The assistant manager role fit without needing to be adjusted. She'd been doing the actual work of it informally for weeks already. She started her business administration courses online in February. Tuesday and Thursday evenings, her laptop open in the small sitting room adjacent to the guest suite, the textbooks she'd ordered with her first increased paycheck stacked on the desk. She was methodical about it. She'd been methodical about everything she'd ever done because there had never been a margin for being otherwise. Kyle noticed. She wasn't sure when she started being aware of this specifically. Not as general awareness of the household's operation, which was clearly habitual and thorough, but the particular texture of his attention when she was in a room. Not intrusive. Not the quality of someone watching for deficiency. Something else. Something she didn't have precise language for, which was itself unusual because she had fairly precise language for most things. The morning coffee had continued. This was the detail she examined most carefully, not the coffee itself. She wasn't naive enough to miss that her continuation of it was a choice, as was his continuation of receiving it, but the way the ritual had mutated slightly over the weeks. He had started staying in the study when she came in rather than leaving immediately after she'd left the coffee. Not engaging her, just remaining. Continued in whatever he'd been doing. She started remaining too, not hovering, not servile, but in the peripheral space of the room, straightening a thing, checking a lamp, occupying the room in the way she'd always been good at. And then occasionally he would say something about what he was reading, about a contract, about something that had no particular significance except that he'd chosen to say it to the person who happened to be present, and the person who happened to be present was her. She said things back, small things at first, then more. The book she was reading for the business course, the discrepancy she'd noticed in the East Wing utility invoices that turned out to be a 3-year billing error they were able to recover on, her theory about the greenhouse scheduling and the cut flower costs. He listened without performing listening, which was its own kind of thing, the particular quality of a person who was accustomed to receiving information strategically and was setting that habit aside. Maria watched all of this with the patient attention of a woman who had opinions she was keeping to herself. In March, Kael came home late from a meeting in the city. This was not unusual. He had late meetings several times a week, and they had in common a quality of leaving him different than when he'd left. Not less controlled, but with more of the control engaged, more of the surface occupied by it, the way a person's whole face can be taken up by an expression that isn't actually what they're feeling. She was in the library when he came in. She'd started using the library in the evenings after her coursework. The estate's library was genuinely excellent, and she had been working her way through it with the particular pleasure of someone who had grown up in places where books were scarce. She heard him come through the front, heard the exchange with the security personnel at the door, heard his steps on the stairs, and then continue down the hall rather than stop at his study. He stopped at the library. He looked at her through the open door, and she looked at him, and there was a moment of the kind that had been accumulating without either of them naming it. "You're still up," he said. "So are you." He came into the library and sat in the chair across from hers without asking, which was correct. It was his library. And he sat there with the air of someone who had come somewhere specific without planning to. She closed the book, keeping her finger in it. "Bad meeting?" she said. "Complicated meeting." She waited. "There are people," he said slowly, choosing each word with visible deliberateness, "who want things from me, who will keep wanting things, who have been in a position to push on those wants recently because they think I'm distracted." "Are you distracted?" He looked at her with the specific look that meant she'd said exactly what he'd been building toward without the approach he'd been planning. "Yeah," he said. The word sat between them in the particular way that a word can sit when it's small and carrying something much larger than its syllable. She didn't say anything for a moment. The fire in the library's east wall, the estate had fireplaces everywhere. It was a house built in an era when this was how you survived the winters, was low. The light from it casting everything in amber. Outside the tall windows, the March night was clear and cold. "The people you're talking about," she said. "Do they have a name?" "Multiple names." He studied the fire. "Stefano Bellucci is the one who concerns me most right now." She'd never heard the name, but she knew from the way he said it that it was a name that came with context she probably didn't have full access to. "He's pushing because you seem distracted," she said. "He's pushing because he thinks he's found the distraction." She understood him. The understanding arrived fully formed, and she sat with it while the fire went down another degree and the night outside stayed clear. Stefano Bellucci had found her. Not her specifically, not yet, but the thing she represented. The deviation from pattern, the new variable, the entry point for leverage in a man who had previously provided very few. "Kael," she said. First time she'd used his name without a prefix. She didn't flag it. "Yeah. What are you going to do?" He looked at her with the expression of someone who had been operating in high-stakes situations for long enough that the expression itself had become its own kind of answer. "Whatever I have to," he said. She nodded once. She opened her book again and found her page, and he stayed in the chair across from her, and neither of them pretended this was a normal evening in a household where a maid read in the library and the man who owned the house sat across from her and told her the name of his enemies. It was not a normal evening. It was also not something that could be easily named. It was April when Victor Hawthorne made contact, not with the estate, not directly, not with anything that could be traced back cleanly to a specific communication that could then be addressed as a specific problem. Victor was smarter than that, or had become smarter in the 3.5 months since his termination, smarter and angrier, and pointed in a direction that had nothing to do with getting his position back and everything to do with something else entirely. The first indication was a man who appeared twice on the security cameras at the estate's perimeter, not doing anything, just appearing, visible for a few seconds on the north fence line, the south gate camera, both times at dusk, both times in a vehicle registered to a logistics company that didn't appear in any database KL's security team ran. The first time, it was filed as a note. The second time, it was escalated. Kael was in the security room when his head of security, a man named Dario, who had worked for him for 8 years, and who did not escalate things unnecessarily, laid out what they had. "The vehicle is a ghost," Dario said. "The registration is legitimate on paper, but the company behind it dissolved 14 months ago. Someone set it up ahead of time." "Who does the construction?" "That's what takes the work." Dario put a photograph on the table. A still from the gate camera, enhanced, the driver visible through the windshield. "We ran facial recognition. He's ex-military, private contractor. His last confirmed employer was a security firm in the Northeast called Sentinel Group." "And?" "Sentinel Group has done contract work for 3 organizations. 2 of them are legitimate. The third is Stefano Bellucci." Kael looked at the photograph for a long moment. "Victor gave him the layout," Kael said. "Everything," Dario said. "If he talked, they have the guard schedules, the entrance points, the camera coverage, all of it." Kael was quiet in the way he was quiet when his calculations were running. Not the absence of thought, but its full operation, moving through variables and outcomes and costs and angles with the efficiency of a machine that had been doing this specific kind of thinking for a long time. "Pull everyone in," he said. "Double the perimeter coverage. No single-person stations anywhere. I want eyes on every vehicle within a 1/4 mile of the property line." He looked at Dario. "And get Leora Bennett moved to the interior of the house. Tonight, quietly. I don't want her in any room with exterior windows until I say otherwise." Dario looked at him. Not the look of a man questioning an order. He didn't question Kael's orders, but the look of a man registering the specific weight of an instruction. "I'll handle it," Dario said. What neither of them said, and what both of them understood. The man on the camera hadn't been scoping the estate's defenses. He'd been scoping something specific. The guard rotations could be worked around. Bellucci had people smart enough for that. The entrance points could be planned for. They always were. What you couldn't work around, if you wanted maximum leverage over a man, was the person he'd started sitting up past midnight to watch breathe. Leora was in the main corridor when Dario found her. She read his face immediately. She'd gotten good at reading the faces in this household, the security personnel especially, who communicated a great deal through what they controlled rather than what they showed, and she stopped walking. "What happened?" she said. "Nothing yet," Dario said. "Mr. De Luca is asking that you move to the interior rooms for the time being." "For the time being," she repeated. "Yes." "How long is the time being, Dario?" He had the look of a man choosing between 2 accurate answers and selecting the one that was less immediately alarming. "Until it's handled," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. The corridor was empty around them. It was late, the household settled, the quiet of an estate after 9 o'clock. "Is it Victor?" she said. Dario said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. She nodded once. She thought about the conversation in the library. The name Stefano Bellucci said with careful weight. The distraction. She understood, arriving at it fully, what she represented in the current equation. Not as a person, as a variable, as the specific point of entry that someone very dangerous had identified in a man who had, apparently, visibly, whatever he had intended or not intended, made the mistake of caring. She followed Dario to the interior rooms. Behind her, somewhere in the estate's east wing, in a room she didn't know about, a man she had never met was reviewing photographs of the De Luca estate that a fired estate manager had provided in exchange for the kind of alliance that gets built on shared grievance and mutual hatred. And in those photographs, Circled in red ink because the man reviewing them was methodical and believed in specificity, was a name written in the margin. Lyora Bennett. The attack came at 4:47 in the morning. Not the gradual kind, not the kind that builds through warning signs and escalating indicators and gives you time to recalibrate. The kind that arrives complete. Perimeter breach, gunfire, glass, and the immediate collapse of any version of the situation that had existed 3 seconds before. Lyora was awake when it started. She'd been awake for an hour already, which she'd attributed to the general low-grade alertness that had been her baseline since Dario had moved her to the interior rooms 2 weeks ago. She'd been lying in the dark with the business administration textbook closed on the bedside table and her eyes on the ceiling, running through the utility audit she'd been working on, which was a thing her brain did at 3 in the morning, reached for the nearest solvable problem and worked it. The audit was almost clean. There was one remaining discrepancy in the February heating invoices that she hadn't been able to source yet. She was thinking about the heating invoice when the first explosion hit the east perimeter. The sound arrived as a physical thing. Not loud the way fireworks were loud, not sharp the way a single gunshot was sharp, but deep and percussive, felt in the sternum before it was heard. Then the security alarms. The estate had a layered alarm system she'd learned in her first week as assistant manager, different tones for different breach types, and what she heard now was not a tone she'd ever heard triggered in practice. It was the one Dario had described during her orientation with the flat voice of a man describing something he'd spent years hoping would remain theoretical. Full perimeter compromise. She was out of the bed before the alarm had completed its first cycle. She did not panic. This was not bravery. It was the particular neurological response of someone who had grown up in situations where panic was the most expensive available option, who had learned early and repeatedly that the brain in crisis needed a single next step rather than the full shape of what it was facing. Next step, shoes. Next step, the small go-bag under the bed that Dario had insisted on 2 weeks ago, which she'd assembled with the same methodical attention she applied to the utility audit. Next step, the door. She had the bag over her shoulder and her hand on the door handle when the second explosion hit, closer this time. The west corridor and the emergency lighting kicked on, red-tinted, installed throughout the interior walls, turning everything the color of something bad. Through the floor, she could feel movement, boots on stone, fast and purposeful. She couldn't tell from the direction whether it was security personnel moving toward the breach or something else moving toward her. She opened the door 6 inches and looked. The corridor was empty. The red light made it strange. At the far end, toward the main staircase, she could hear radio communication, clipped, fast, the security team's channel she'd learned to recognize from 2 months of living in a house where it was always running somewhere in the background. Then she heard her name, Cale's voice, not on her radio, not from a distance, from the staircase, moving fast, and she opened the door fully, and he was already in the corridor, dressed in the dark tactical gear she'd seen hanging in the security room but never seen on him, and his face had the quality she hadn't seen before, which was the quality of a situation he was inside rather than managing from its edge. "Move," he said. Not loudly, precisely. "With me. Now." She moved. He took her arm, not roughly, not gently, the specific grip of someone navigating a physical problem, and they went the opposite direction from the staircase, toward the east corridor, which connected to the section of the house she hadn't had full access to before. He had a gun. She registered it in his right hand without fixating on it because it was information and not the most urgent information. "How many?" she said, keeping her voice under the alarm. 8 confirmed, possibly more." He reached a door she'd always seen locked, and it opened with a key code she'd never been given. Beyond it, stairs going down, stone, old, the basement level of a house that had been built when basements were where you kept the things you didn't want found. Victor gave them the entire layout. They came through the north access point. There's a maintenance tunnel that runs from the property line to the boiler room. It's not on the official security map. She understood. The tunnel wasn't on the security map because Victor had been the one who maintained the security map. "Where are we going?" she said. "There's a passage under the east wing. Comes out at the secondary garage. I have a vehicle there." He moved through the basement at a pace that knew this space. Knew it in the way of someone who had planned for exactly this, who had mapped this route not as a contingency, but as a certainty. Dario has the north and west covered. My people will hold the house. But I need you out. Your people are outnumbered. They've been outnumbered before. They moved through the basement's outer room. Stone walls, industrial shelving, the deep cold smell of a space that didn't get used enough to be warm, toward a narrow door at the far end. Upstairs, through the floor, the gunfire had a different quality now, more sustained, the perimeter response shifting into something that was going to take time to resolve. She said, "This wasn't about the estate." He glanced at her. "If they wanted to hit you, they would have hit the car. Or the Albany meeting, or they know your patterns. They've been watching for weeks. They had 8 people and they brought them here, inside the walls." She held his gaze for a moment in the red emergency light. "They came for me." He didn't confirm it because he didn't need to. His expression in that moment was the confirmation. The particular combination of calculation and something else, something she'd seen once before, the night he'd walked out into the blizzard, and which she didn't have clean language for but recognized. "The passage," he said. "Go." The secondary garage held 3 vehicles, all dark, all running by the time they came through the passage door. Someone had been here ahead of them. Dario's preparation, she understood. The pre-positioned piece of the plan that had been in place since the perimeter photographs 2 weeks ago. One of the security team, a woman named Reyes, who Leora had exchanged exactly 11 words with in 4 months of living in the same house, was at the wheel of the center vehicle. Kael opened the back door. She got in. He stopped at the door. She looked at him. The garage was cold. The doors not yet open, the vehicle's exhaust building in the enclosed space, and the red of the emergency lighting didn't reach here. So what she saw was in the gray of the interior overhead lights, and he was looking at her with the expression of a man making a calculation that had already been completed, but that he was verifying one more time. "I'm not coming with you," he said. "I know. Reyes will take you to the mountain house. It's 4 hours. My best people are there. You'll be safe," she said. "I know." She looked at him. "Go back in there." Leora. She'd heard him use her name before. He'd been using it for months. But the way it sat in his mouth right now was different. Carrying something he was not, in the middle of a tactical situation with his estate under assault, going to have the time or the context to say properly. She knew this. "When it's done," she said. He held her gaze for one more second. Then he closed the door and he was gone, back through the passage, back into the house, where the gunfire was still moving through its ugly rhythm, and Reyes hit the garage door opener and the doors rolled up on a pre-dawn April sky that was just beginning to show its edges, cold and clear. Nothing in it that indicated the estate behind them was burning. They drove north. Leora sat in the back seat and watched the Hudson Valley move past the windows and didn't speak, and Reyes didn't offer speech, which was correct. What she was doing internally was the thing she'd always done with situations too large to process as a whole. She was breaking it into its component parts and examining each one. The attack, the tunnel, Victor's information, Stefano Bellucci's name from the library conversation 2 months ago, when he'd said it like a thing he was preparing for. She was still examining the components when her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Unknown number, text message, sent at 5:12, which was 14 minutes ago, which meant it had been sent during the attack while she was still in the basement. It said, "We don't want DeLuca. We want to talk to you." She stared at the message for a long time without moving. Then she looked at the back of Reyes's head and she said, "Reyes, stop the car." "Ma'am?" "Stop the car." Reyes pulled to the shoulder of the county road, empty at this hour, the pre-dawn gray filling the windows. She turned in her seat and looked at Leora with the expression of someone who had instructions she was weighing against a new variable. Leora showed her the phone. Reyes looked at the message. Her face did something careful and controlled. "I need to call this in," she said. "Call it in," Leora said. "But read the message first, all of it." Reyes took the phone and read it. Then she scrolled because there was more. A second message, sent 30 seconds after the first, that Leora had already read, and that Reyes was now reading, and that had changed the shape of everything. It said, "We have Victor. He told us more than you know. Come alone to the address below, or we send what he told us to every news outlet on the East Coast. DeLuca's name on federal documents he doesn't know exist. By noon today. Reyes put the phone down very carefully, the way you put down a thing that has suddenly become a different thing than you thought it was. I have to call this in, she said again. I know, Leora said. Call Kael. She watched Reyes dial. Watched her speak into the phone in clipped, precise sentences, relaying the message content, the number, the timestamp. Watched her face while she listened to whatever came back on the other end. The county road was empty in both directions. A crow sat on the fence line to their left and regarded the stopped vehicle with the flat professional interest of a creature that had seen worse. Reyes ended the call.
Hey, boss, me.
He wants you at the mountain house, she said. He says don't respond to the message. He says he'll handle it. Leora was quiet. Ms. Bennett, I heard you. She had heard her. She was also sitting with the text message in its specific dimensions. Federal documents he doesn't know exist. The phrasing was deliberate, chosen to produce exactly the response it was producing, which was the question of what Victor Hawthorne had provided to Stefano Bellucci beyond security layouts and guard rotations. Victor had been in this household for 11 years. He had managed every operational aspect of an estate belonging to a man whose legitimate business interests were an incomplete picture of his actual operations. He had filed paperwork, he had maintained records, he had, for 11 years, been in the rooms where things were discussed that were not for external consumption. What did an 11-year estate manager know? What had he given to a man who now had it and was offering to burn it to federal authorities by noon if a 19-year-old assistant manager didn't show up alone to a location he'd specified? She looked out the window at the crow on the fence post. Take me to the mountain house, she said. The mountain house was 4 hours north, as Reyes had said. A property that appeared on no listing and no map, accessible via a private road off a county route that most people would not take unless they knew to take it. It sat on 40 acres of Adirondack hillside with sight lines in every direction and a security infrastructure that Leora understood now was not the infrastructure of a man who had built it as a backup plan. This had been built as a primary facility. This was where Kael DeLuca's actual continuity lived when his primary residence was compromised. The people here were different from the estate staff, quieter in a different way, more present physically, the way they occupied a room, the way their eyes moved. Leora had spent 4 months learning the rhythms of the estate security team, and she understood by comparison that she had been learning the B team. She was given a room. She was given food she didn't eat. She was given a tablet with access to her work files, which was someone's attempt to normalize the situation, which she appreciated in theory and could not use in practice because she could not stop thinking about the second text message. Federal documents he doesn't know exist. At 9 o'clock, Kael called. She answered before the first ring completed. Are you okay? He said. Yes. The house? Held. 3 casualties on their side. 2 of mine in the hospital, both stable. Victor's contact, the man from the perimeter photographs, was captured in the East Access Tunnel. She exhaled. And Victor? There was a pause. It was a short pause, 2-3 seconds. But it had a texture she picked up on immediately, the texture of a pause that is covering something rather than organizing something. Kael. Victor wasn't with them, he said. We have the contact. He's talking. Victor made the introduction between the contact and Bellucci's people 3 months ago and then went dark. The contact hasn't seen him since February. She sat with this. Victor doesn't have Victor, she said. No. Then who sent the text message? Another pause. This one shorter. We're running the number. It'll take time. It said federal documents you don't know exist. She kept her voice level. 11 years, Kael. What could he have had access to in 11 years that... I know what he could have had access to. The flatness in his voice was different from his usual flatness. It was the flatness of something hitting a wall. She'd never heard that in him before, The wall, the place where the calculation stopped moving and just sat there. It's real, she said. Not a question. I don't know the scope yet. She stood up from the chair she'd been sitting in and moved to the window, which looked out at the hillside, the trees, the pale morning of an April day that had started with gunfire and arrived here, at this conversation. and she pressed her free hand flat against the cold glass. "Whoever sent that message," she said, "they knew about the attack. They sent it during the attack. That means they knew it was happening." "Yes." "So it's not Bellucci, because Bellucci ran the attack, and if he wanted to offer terms, he'd do it from a position, not from a burner number at 5 in the morning." "That's right." "Then someone else knows. Someone who has the documents or claims to. Someone who used the attack as their moment to make contact because they knew you'd be occupied." She stopped. She turned away from the window. The room was small and neat and entirely unfamiliar. "It's a second party. There's someone else in this." The silence on the line was the silence of a man who had reached this conclusion 20 minutes before she had and was waiting to see how far she'd follow it. "Who?" she said. "I have a name," he said. "I've had it for 6 hours. I've been trying to find a version of this conversation where I tell you, and it lands differently." She waited. He said the name. She didn't know it. It meant nothing to her, which she could tell from his tone was not the case for him. She said so. "He was my father's accountant," Kyle said, "from before I took over. I kept him because he knew the architecture of the old operation better than anyone. I trusted him because he'd been there from the beginning, because he knew where every piece was buried and he'd never moved against them. Until now. Until now." His voice had the quality of a thing being said that is true and that the speaker has not yet fully metabolized the truth of. "He's been feeding information to a federal investigation for 14 months, not to Bellucci, separately, parallel. He used Bellucci's attack as cover to surface. He wants a deal." She understood the shape of it now. The full shape, all the way through, the thing that had been building underneath the winter and the spring, and the morning coffee, and the library conversations, and the mountain house and everything. "And the deal involves me," she said. "He says he'll pull the documents from the federal contact if I give up the Bellucci pursuit. Let Stefano walk. And he wants Bellucci's people to know you're not under my protection anymore." The room was very quiet. "He wants you to hand me over," she said. "He wants me to make you accessible." The distinction was precise, and Kyle made it precisely, and she understood that the distinction mattered to him and that it did not change what the words meant in practice. "He thinks I'll do it. He thinks I've been in this long enough that protecting the operation is the calculation that wins." She looked at the wall across from her. A painting on it, something abstract, blues and grays, chosen for a mountain safe house by someone who had tried to make it livable without quite managing it. "Has he always thought that?" she said. "Probably," Kyle said. "Until recently, he probably would have been right." She closed her eyes for a moment. "What are you going to do?" she said. The line was quiet for 5 seconds. Outside the mountain house windows, the April hillside held its stillness, trees beginning their first green, the ground still damp from the snowmelt, a world that was moving forward at its own pace without any interest in the specific conversation happening in this room. "I'm going to need you to stay where you are," Kyle said. "I need you safe while I—" "Kyle." Her voice was very steady. "He's going to burn those documents whether you comply or not. People like that always burn the documents. The documents are their only leverage, and leverage only works once, so they burn it, and then they're protected because they're cooperating witnesses, and you're—" She stopped. "How bad is it?" The silence that followed was the longest one yet. When he spoke again, his voice had the specific quality of a man choosing to tell the truth to someone he had decided deserves the truth, regardless of what the truth costs. "Bad enough," he said, "that if it surfaces, I don't see a path where I'm not federally indicted within 6 months. The operation, the old one, my father's architecture, there are things in it that I built on top of without fully understanding what was underneath. Things I've been trying to dismantle for 6 years without moving fast enough." He paused. "I knew the risk. I thought I had more time." She sat down on the edge of the bed. "Your father's accountant," she said, "who has federal documents, who is cooperating with an investigation that's been running for 14 months, who surfaced today during an armed attack on your estate to demand you hand over the girl you pulled out of a blizzard." She looked at the abstract painting. "And if you don't comply, he burns it. And if you do comply, then Bellucci's people have access to you," Kyle said. "And a man who spent 2 months watching this estate through a perimeter camera to figure out what I care about gets to test his theory." The morning light through the mountain house windows was full now. The gray gone, replaced by the clean, hard brightness of an April day at elevation, the kind of light that showed everything. She understood, sitting in it, that there was no good version of this, that the path forward required either Kyl's destruction or her exposure, and that a third option did not currently exist, and that the man who had constructed this particular trap was not a fool. He had spent 14 months building it. He had waited for exactly this configuration. Not just the documents, not just the rival organization, but the specific emotional variable that had appeared in the winter, unexpectedly, in the form of a 19-year-old who brought coffee at 7 o'clock and read in the library and had, without meaning to, become the one thing a man with no weaknesses had allowed himself to have. She set the phone down on the bed beside her without ending the call. She could hear him, faintly, saying her name into the empty air. She picked the phone back up. "I'm here," she said. "I need you to stay." "I heard you," she said. "I'm going to stay here. I'm going to stay exactly where you put me." She breathed. "And then you're going to figure this out. You're going to find the third option that doesn't exist yet. Because you're the man who walked into a blizzard at 10 o'clock at night for a girl he'd never spoken to, and you don't do things without finding a way through them." The line was quiet. "That's a significant amount of faith," he said. "Yeah," she said, "it is." She ended the call. She sat on the edge of the bed in the mountain house with the April light coming through the windows and her father's accountant's name sitting in her head like a splinter, a name she hadn't known until 20 minutes ago, and that had reorganized everything she understood about the situation she was inside. And she thought about the heating invoice discrepancies she'd never been able to source. February. Consistent overcharge across 3 invoice cycles. A vendor that appeared in the system under a name she'd cross-referenced twice without finding a match in the legitimate vendor database. She opened the tablet. She pulled up the estate's financial records, which she had access to as assistant manager, the legitimate business accounts, the vendor database, the invoice archive she'd been working through for 3 months. She went back to February. She found the heating invoices. She found the vendor name. She ran it against the name Kyle had just given her. The match came back in 4 seconds. The vendor account had been created 8 years ago. It had been processing payments, small ones, consistent, the kind of small, consistent payments that disappear into the noise of a large estate's operating costs. For 8 years, routed to an account in a name she now recognized. 14 months of federal cooperation. 14 months of actively feeding information. But the money trail went back 8 years, which meant the accountant hadn't turned against Kyle's operation 14 months ago. He had been against it from the beginning, and someone, somewhere, had been paying him to stay close, paying him through a vendor account buried in the estate's legitimate records, where a thorough assistant manager working through a utility audit might eventually, given enough time and enough quiet evenings with a... She called him back in 40 seconds. He picked up before the first ring finished, which told her he'd been sitting with the phone in his hand. "The accountant's name is Raymond Crest," she said. "He's been running a vendor account through the estate's heating invoices for 8 years. Not 14 months, 8 years. The payments are small, consistent, routed to an account I can trace if you give me 20 minutes and access to the business registry database." Silence on the line. "Leora, he didn't turn 14 months ago. He was placed. Someone put him next to your father before you took over, and he's been there ever since." She had the tablet open, the invoice archive scrolling on the screen, the numbers arranging themselves into the shape of something that had been hiding in plain sight for years. The federal cooperation is real, but it's secondary. The primary operation was intelligence collection. Someone wanted a man inside this organization from the beginning. She heard him breathing. "Who's the account registered to?" he said. "That's what I need the business registry for." He gave her an access code without asking anything else. She typed it in. The registry database opened. A commercial system, private, the kind used by people who needed to trace corporate structures through shell companies and subsidiary holdings without relying on public records. She ran the vendor account number. The first shell resolved to a holding company in Delaware. The second shell resolved to a logistics subsidiary in New Jersey. The third, and there was always a third because people who built these structures believed the third layer was sufficient, resolved to an LLC registered 8 years and 3 months ago, 2 months before Raymond Crest had accepted the position in the DeLuca household, and the registered agent of that LLC was a name she'd never heard. But the secondary contact on the registration was Stefano Bellucci. She stopped moving entirely. Kael, her voice came out very flat. Bellucci didn't find out about the operation from Victor. He's been inside it for 8 years. Crest is his man. The attack this morning, the text message, the federal documents, it's not 2 separate threats. It's one. The line was completely silent for 4 seconds. He set it up, Kael said, and his voice had the quality of a man watching a structure he'd built his life on develop a crack that ran all the way to the foundation. He placed Crest before I took over. He waited. He's been waiting 8 years for the right configuration. And the right configuration was me, she said. She said it without bitterness, because bitterness required a kind of surprise she didn't have access to. The architecture of it was almost elegant. The patience of it, the construction. A man who had decided 8 years ago that the way to destroy the DeLuca operation was not through force, but through penetration, through a sleeper installed at the center of the household's legitimate structure, waiting for the specific vulnerability that would make the timing right, waiting for Kael DeLuca to care about something he couldn't afford to lose. "Where's Crest now?" she said. "We're finding out." A pause. "You're staying at the mountain house." "I know. I mean it, Leora." "I know you mean it. I said I know." She closed the tablet. "What are you going to do?" "The only thing that works," he said. "I'm going to the council." She understood enough by now to understand what this meant. The 5 families governed the Eastern Territories through a structure that predated Kael's tenure, and that operated on principles she'd absorbed through 4 months of living inside its peripheral reality. Disputes were brought to the council, evidence was presented, and the council's judgment was binding in a way that made it the only institutional check on the kind of power that didn't otherwise have checks. "Bellucci is on the council," she said. "He has a seat. He doesn't have a majority. And what I'm bringing them goes beyond a territorial dispute." She could hear him moving now, the sound of footsteps on stone, doors. "Crest's placement predates me. It predates my father's last year. What Bellucci built wasn't aimed at me specifically. It was aimed at the DeLuca organization as an entity. That's a violation that every family on that council has an interest in condemning, because if it worked here, it works anywhere." He'll deny it. "He'll try." Something shifted in his voice. The specific shift she'd heard only a few times, the one that moved underneath the calculation. "I have 8 years of payment records, a shell company traceable to his registration, and a man in custody who has been talking since 6 this morning. Dario has been running the interrogation for 3 hours. The contact from the tunnel. He knows more than his job description required. Bellucci liked to consolidate, keep the number of people in the loop small. That means the ones who are in the loop know a great deal." A door closed on his end. "I'll be in front of the council by this afternoon. You stay where you are, and you don't respond to any messages until I tell you it's done." "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. Neither of them ended the call for a moment. "Kael." She said his name in the specific way she'd been allowing herself to say it for about 6 weeks, the way that didn't have a qualifier attached to it. "Be careful." "Always," he said, which was not true, and they both knew it, and then he was gone. She put the phone down on the bed and sat in the April brightness and thought about a man who had been placed inside a household 2 months before she was born, waiting for a configuration that would take 8 years to arrive. And she thought about her mother's photograph in the bag on the floor and the library book she'd been halfway through before the morning had demolished all previous versions of the day. And then she stood up and went to find the mountain house kitchen because she hadn't eaten since the previous evening, and the body's requirements did not suspend themselves for dramatic timing. Reyes was in the kitchen. She looked up when Leora came in with the expression of a woman recalibrating which version of the person in front of her she was dealing with. "You figured something out," Reyes said. Something was already figured out. She opened the refrigerator. "Do you have any coffee?" "There's a machine." "I'll find it." She made coffee, and she ate something that existed in the mountain house pantry without tasting it, and she sat at the kitchen table and she waited, which was the hardest available option and the only correct one. The call came at 1:47 in the afternoon. Not Kael, Dario. "The council convened at noon," Dario said. "He's presenting now. I need you to stay off the phone for the next 2 hours. Don't reach out to anyone. Don't respond to anything that comes in from an unknown number. If Bellucci's people try to make contact before the council finishes, they're doing it to disrupt the proceeding. You don't give them anything to work with." "Understood." She paused. "How is he?" "Doing what he does," Dario said, which was not an assessment of his emotional state, but she took what was available. 2 hours. Stay off the line." She put the phone down. She stayed off the line. The 2 hours were the longest she'd spent since the blizzard, since the pine tree, since the cold taking her focus, and then her consciousness, and then everything available to take. She sat in the Mountain House common room, and she read 40 pages of a book she found on the shelf without retaining a single sentence of it. And she watched the April afternoon move across the windows, the light shifting from its high noon flatness into the early angle warmth of mid-afternoon. And she did not reach for the phone, and she did not walk to the window to look at the road, because there was nothing coming down the road yet, and watching for it would not make it come faster. At 3:51, the phone rang. She picked it up and said nothing. "It's done," Kael said. She exhaled. "Bellucci?" The council condemned the placement operation unanimously, including his own allies. He tried to deny the LLC connection, and we put the documents in front of 4 senior representatives who have seen this kind of structure before and knew exactly what they were looking at. His voice was flat in the way it was flat after sustained effort, not calm, but empty of everything that wasn't immediately necessary. "He's required to surrender Crest to us and withdraw all active operations against this organization within 72 hours. His seat on the council is suspended pending a full review." "And the federal documents?" "Crest built the case using records from my father's operation, not mine. The specific documents he was offering to surface, they predate my tenure, and the federal investigation they're tied to has been inactive for 3 years. My legal team has been sitting on a filing that addresses the exposure. We file today. It's not clean, but it's manageable." She nodded, which he couldn't see. "And Victor?" A pause. "Bellucci produced him as part of the surrender terms. He's in custody." Another pause, shorter. "I know what you're going to say." "Do you?" "You're going to say not to let this be about what he did to you." She was quiet for a moment. "I was going to say that destroying him is the short game. Handing him to federal authorities with everything Dario's team has compiled is the long one. He spends the rest of his life in a room instead of a year in the news, and then gone. But that's your call." The line was quiet. "It's not my call," he said. "Not entirely." "Then that's what I want," she said. "The room, the rest of his life in it." She heard something on his end that she couldn't categorize. Not a sound exactly, more a shift in the quality of the silence. "Okay," he said. "Come home," she said. "I'm already moving," he said. He was. The convoy arrived at the Mountain House at 6:43 in the evening. She heard the vehicles on the road 20 minutes before they came through the gate, the sound of multiple engines on the private route, and she was in the common room, and she did not go to the window, and she did not go outside, and she made herself stay where she was, because there was a version of this where she ran out to meet the cars, and that was not the version she was going to perform. The door opened. He came through it with Dario behind him and 2 of the other security personnel, and he stopped inside the doorway and looked at her across the room, and neither of them moved for a moment. He looked like what he was, a man who had been in 3 consecutive high-stakes situations across a 15-hour span, who had conducted a council proceeding and negotiated a surrender and handled 4 different legal crises since 6 in the morning, whose jacket was gone and whose shirt had the look of something that had been through more than a single day. He looked at her like he was checking something. She looked back at him to confirm it was intact. Then Dario moved past him into the room, and the security personnel dispersed to their stations, and the moment became the room again, and she was standing up from the chair. "Are you hurt?" she said. "No." "Dario said your man in the hospital, both stable. The more serious one came out of surgery at 4. He'll be okay." He crossed the room, not fast, not performing anything, just moving toward her with the directness of a man who had spent a long day being indirect about everything that mattered and was done with it. He stopped 3 feet from her. "You found the vendor account." "It was always going to surface," she said. "The heating invoices were 3 cycles off. I just hadn't traced them far enough yet." "You traced them far enough this morning." "I had motivation. Something moved across his face. Not the almost smile she'd catalogued from the early months. Something more direct, less contained. The expression of a man standing in a room at the end of a day that had gone as wrong as a day could go, and then resolved, improbably, and who was looking at the person most responsible for the resolution. "I owe you," he said. "You walked into a blizzard for me," she said. "I found a vendor account. We're not close to even." "I wasn't calculating even." "I know you weren't." She was standing close enough now that she had to look up slightly, and his hands came up, both of them, slow, deliberate, and cupped her face the way she'd thought about in the weeks since the library, in the specific quiet of evenings when she'd been alone with the thought and not done anything with it. His thumbs were at her cheekbones. His hands were the temperature of a man who'd been in the cold. "I told you what I am," he said. "What this is. I know what you told me," she said. "I did the research. In January. All of it, the full picture. I've known for 3 months." He was very still. "You stayed," he said. "I stayed." "Leora." His voice had the particular quality it had in the library that night, carrying something too large for the single word assigned to transport it. "I already chose you," she said. "Months ago. I just didn't say it." His forehead came down against hers and she felt him exhale. The long, deep exhale of a man releasing something that had been held in compression for longer than she could fully account for. His hands stayed at her face. Outside the mountain house windows, the April evening was moving toward dark, the hillside going from green to gray to the particular blue of the hour before night. And inside the room the day was over, all of it, the attack and the tunnel and the council and the documents and the 8 years and the blizzard and all the mornings before it and all the evenings in the library and every cup of coffee placed in exactly the right position. All of it arrived here, at this forehead pressed to hers, at this breath releasing. They almost kissed. His phone went off. He didn't move for a moment. The phone went off again. The specific tone she'd learned was Dario's emergency signal. Not the regular call tone, but the one that meant stop whatever you're doing. He lifted his head. His jaw was very tight. He looked at her for one more second, the expression of a man making a promise non-verbally, the kind that doesn't require words because the words would be inadequate anyway. And then he stepped back and answered the phone. She watched his face. She'd gotten good at reading it. She watched it move through reception, through processing, through the specific rearrangement that happened when new information overrode the previous operating state. She watched it arrive somewhere she hadn't seen before. "Where?" he said. Not a question, a demand. He listened. "How long ago?" He listened. "Lock down the mountain house, full team, exterior stations, nothing moves in or out until I give the all clear." He looked at Leora while he said this. Looked at her the way he'd looked at her from the chair by the hospital bed. The checking quality, the inventory of intact. "I'm coming to you." He ended the call. She said, "What happened?" "Crest," he said. He didn't wait for the surrender terms to be executed. When Bellucci's people went to collect him, he was gone. He had a window, maybe 2 hours between when the council concluded and when Bellucci's compliance team moved. He used it. Where did he go? Kael's expression had the particular quality she was learning to read as its most dangerous configuration. Not hot, not loud, not the performed menace she'd seen him use in professional contexts. Completely, totally, still. "He went to the estate," he said. "The DeLuca estate. He's inside the house right now." She stared at him. "The house is partially secured from this morning," Kael said, already moving toward the door, already reassembling the operational version of himself with the speed of a man who had been doing this for years. "Dario has 3 men on site doing structural assessment. They're not a combat unit. Crest has been in that building for 11 years. He knows every room, every passage, every place to move without being—" "Maria," Leora said. He stopped. "Maria is in that house," she said. "She was staying through the week to manage the post-attack inventory. She's there with 2 kitchen staff and whoever Dario left for structural assessment." The room was very quiet. Kael looked at her with the expression of a man for whom 2 things have just become simultaneously, maximally urgent: the operational problem and the specific human weight of it. And she looked back at him with the expression of a woman who understood both dimensions and was not going to perform either panic or false calm. Get in the car, he said. Right behind you, she said. They moved. The convoy covered the 4 hours back to the estate in 2 hours and 40 minutes, pushing the vehicles through the April night on roads that were empty, and then less empty, and then empty again as they hit the long county route that ran along the property's edge, the same road she'd traveled that morning, reversed, the dark coming in fully now, the mountains behind them and the Hudson Valley ahead, the estate's lights visible at the top of the rise as they came around the final curve. Dario was on the phone with her the entire last 30 minutes. Crest came in through the maintenance tunnel, Dario said. The one from this morning. We hadn't sealed it yet. It was on the structural assessment list for tomorrow. He knows it better than anyone. Where is he in the house? We don't have eyes. He cut the interior camera feed from the security room junction. He knows where the junction is because he was in that room hundreds of times. A pause, the specific pause of a man controlling what he was about to say next. Ms. Bennett, Maria and the kitchen staff are unaccounted for. The car went very fast over a very dark road. He's not going to hurt them, she said. She didn't know this for certain. She said it anyway. Crest's leverage was always the documents. He's losing the documents. The only card he has left is a hostage. Dario was quiet. Which means he's going to want to talk, she said. He's going to want to negotiate. He has people in the house, and I'm the negotiating chip he lost access to this afternoon. So when we get there, Kyle said from beside her, you stay in the vehicle. Kyle, until I know where he is and what he has, you stay in the vehicle. His voice had the quality of a thing that would not be negotiated. That's not a request. She looked at him. He looked back. The estate gates appeared through the windshield. The convoy slowed. Dario's voice came through the phone one more time. Boss. He made contact. He's in the library. He has Maria and one of the kitchen staff. He says he'll talk to one person. A pause. He asked for Ms. Bennett. The car stopped. She looked at Kyle. His jaw was hard. His hands were flat on his thighs. She could see the specific tension in his neck, the way the muscle ran from jaw to shoulder and had pulled itself into something close to stone. He was looking at the gate, not at her, and she understood what was happening inside the calculation. The simultaneous presence of every possible outcome and the specific weight of each one, running against each other at speed, arriving at the place where the options had been sorted and ranked, and one of them was... She opened the car door. Kyle's hand came across and closed around her wrist. Not hard, not restraining, just present. The specific weight of a hand that knew it could not stop what was about to happen and was doing the only thing available to it. She turned and looked at him. His face in the low light of the car's interior was stripped of all the management she'd spent months learning to read past. What was underneath was not soft. It was never going to be soft. It was built from material that didn't allow for that. But it was unguarded in a way that she'd only seen twice before. The blizzard night, the library, and now this, a man holding her wrist at the gates of his own estate, while somewhere inside his house a cornered man waited with Maria and a kitchen worker and the last piece of leverage he had left. You don't have to do this, he said. I know I don't. Leora. He asked for me, she said, which means he thinks he can use me, which means he needs me willing, or at minimum present. He won't hurt Maria while he thinks I'm coming. She looked at the hand around her wrist and then back at his face. Let me go in. I'll be behind you. I know. Every step. You won't see me, but I'll be... I know, she said again quietly. KL. I know. He released her wrist. She got out of the car. The estate at night after an attack had a specific quality she'd never encountered in any version of a house she'd lived in before. The smell of it first, the sharp chemical residue from the morning's breaches, the faint underlying smoke from where one of the East Wing security stations had burned. The emergency lighting had been partially restored, casting the grounds in pools of white rather than the comprehensive coverage of the normal system, which meant there were shadows where shadows didn't usually exist. The main house stood with most of its windows lit from inside, the ones that hadn't shattered in the morning, and from the outside it still looked like what it was. A grand old building, built to last centuries, wearing this day's damage the way a person wears injury, visible if you knew where to look, trying not to show it to those who didn't. Dario met her at the base of the front steps. He was carrying a radio, and his jacket had a tear at the shoulder she didn't ask about. He's been in contact twice in the last 20 minutes, Dario said. He has Maria and Lynn. One of the kitchen staff, 23 years old. She started 4 months ago. He says they're unharmed. He wants to talk terms. What terms? Safe passage out. A vehicle. 48 hours before we make any calls to any authorities. Dario's voice was completely neutral, the neutrality of professional assessment. He knows the council condemned Bellucci. He knows his leverage with the documents is gone. The filing your legal team submitted this afternoon effectively neutralized the federal exposure. He has nothing left except the 2 people in that room and the ask. He knows he's finished, she said. He knows he's finished, Dario confirmed. This is the end of the road, and he knows it. What he doesn't know is how it ends. She nodded once. Keep Kyle outside until I tell you otherwise. Dario looked at her with the expression she'd first taken for blankness and had learned was precision. The face of a man who evaluated information against outcomes and made decisions accordingly. He won't stay outside indefinitely. I know, I just need 10 minutes. She went up the stairs. The foyer was quiet in a way that felt wrong after months of it being the organized, purposeful quiet of a well-run household. Some of the garland from Christmas was still on the upper balustrade. It had never been fully cleared after the night it started, the night the vase shattered and the doors locked and the storm took everything available to take. She noticed it without dwelling on it and moved through the foyer to the corridor that led to the library. The library door was closed. She knocked twice and pushed it open. Raymond Crest was standing beside the fireplace. She'd seen him twice in 4 months, both times briefly. He'd visited the estate in February for what Maria had described as a quarterly account review. A small man in his mid-60s with the look of someone who had spent decades making himself unremarkable, who had perfected the particular invisibility of the trusted professional. He was dressed now in the same category of clothing, dark, neat, nothing that drew attention, and he held himself with the stillness of someone who had arrived at a conclusion and was waiting to see if the world would cooperate with it. Maria was sitting in the chair by the window. She was upright, not restrained, her hands folded in her lap, in the specific posture of a woman controlling what she could control when everything else was outside that category. She looked at Leora when she came through the door, and something in her face shifted. Relief, sharp and immediate, followed by the equally immediate suppression of it, because Maria Alvarez had been managing her reactions in difficult rooms for longer than Leora had been alive. Lynn was on the small sofa against the east wall. She was 23, and she was afraid in the visible, unmanaged way of someone who hadn't yet built the architecture for hiding it, and she was looking at the door with an expression that Leora recognized without judgment, because she'd worn it herself in rooms where the outcome wasn't certain. Crest looked at her. His eyes were brown, very still, the eyes of a man who had spent 40 years watching and not being watched. He had a phone in one hand, nothing else. No weapon she could see, which meant either he didn't have one or he had it somewhere she couldn't identify. She had been in enough situations by now to treat these as equivalent possibilities. "Ms. Bennett," he said. "Mr. Crest." She came into the room and closed the door behind her and stood without approaching him. Just present, visible, the thing he'd asked for. "You wanted to talk." "I wanted options," he said. "The distinction matters." "All right," she said. "What options are you looking for?" He studied her for a moment. The fireplace behind him was lit. She noticed that someone had lit it during the evening, which meant he'd been here long enough to make himself comfortable or cold enough to not care about the indication. The library had the same amber light it always had at night, the same weighted quiet of books and old wood, and it was profoundly strange to be standing in this room that had become, over months, one of the places she thought of as hers, watching it be something else. "Safe passage," he said. "What I told your man on the radio. A vehicle, a head start. In exchange for them," she said. "Yes. They're not yours to exchange." His expression didn't change. "Everything is exchangeable, Ms. Bennett. That's the principle this household has always operated on." "Is it?" She looked at him steadily. "You've been in this household for 8 years. You watched it operate. You watched Kyle take over from his father and spend 6 years trying to change what it was built on. And you stayed close to it the entire time because Bellucci needed intelligence, and you were the intelligence, and that was the principle you operated on. She tilted her head slightly. So you tell me whose principle that actually was. Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite surprise. Closer to recalibration. You're 19 years old, he said. I've been poor my whole life, she said. Poverty makes you pay attention to power. Who has it? How they use it? What they tell themselves about why they use it the way they do. She kept her voice even, unhurried. You told yourself you were the smart one, the one who got close without getting caught, who played the long game. 8 years is a long game, I'll give you that. It was supposed to be shorter, he said. There was something in it, not quite regret, not quite admission, but the tone of a man who had allowed himself, in this room with no moves left, to be briefly honest. What was supposed to happen? She said. DeLuca was supposed to expand the way his father would have. Instead, he contracted, consolidated, changed the architecture. He looked at the fire. Every time I built a case for the federal contact, he'd already moved away from the thing I was documenting. 6 years of him being one step ahead of what I was reporting. I don't think he knew I was there. I think he was just different than expected. So you ran out of time, she said, and Bellucci ran out of patience. Bellucci ran out of patience a year ago, Crest said. This morning was his, not mine. I told him it was too early, that we didn't have everything we needed yet. He looked at her with the directness of a man who has nothing left to manage. And then you started working through the invoices, and I knew the vendor account was going to surface within a month regardless. She nodded. So you used the attack as cover, she said. You surfaced on your own terms before I could surface the account on mine. You tried to trade the documents for a version of the situation where you still had control of the exit. Yes. And it didn't work. No, he said. It didn't work. The fire made its low sound. Outside the library windows, the estate grounds were dark and still. She could not see Kael or Dario or any of the security team, which meant they were positioned correctly. Let them go, she said. Crest looked at Maria, then at Lynn, then at the phone in his hand. He turned the phone over once, then he looked at Leora. And then what? He said. And then I walk out with them, she said. And you make whatever call you need to make, to whoever you've been cooperating with for 14 months, and you tell them you want to come in. Formally. With whatever you have left. She paused. The documents you tried to use this morning, most of them are pre-tenure, and the legal filing addresses the exposure. But you know things that aren't in documents. You know the structure of Bellucci's operation from the inside, 8 years of it, including things that haven't been activated yet. That's worth something to the people you've been talking to. He was very still. You're offering me a deal, he said. I'm describing your only remaining option that doesn't end in a room for the rest of your life, she said. You came in here because you wanted options. That's the option. It's not good, but it's real. He looked at her for a long moment. She didn't move. She didn't perform confidence or perform calm. She just stood in it. The specific stillness she'd developed in years of rooms where the outcome wasn't hers to control, where the only available strategy was to be exactly present and let the other person arrive at their own conclusion. Crest put the phone in his jacket pocket. He looked at Maria. You can go, he said. Maria stood. She was composed with the absolute composure of a woman who had been composing herself in this manner for 53 years, and who was going to finish this with the same quality she'd started it. She moved to where Lynn was sitting and put her hand on the younger woman's shoulder and said, Come on, baby, let's go, in a voice that was so steady it almost broke something in the room, and Lynn stood and they moved toward the door. Maria stopped beside Leora. She looked at her. She put one hand briefly on Leora's face, the same gesture from the morning in the grand hall, the same 2 hands on her shoulders, the same warmth that was not sentimental but was entirely real. And then she moved past her through the door, taking Lynn with her, and they were gone. Leora looked at Crest. Make the call, she said. She turned and walked out. The corridor was full of people the moment she cleared the library door. Kael first, who had been 6 feet from the library entrance because he was constitutionally incapable of staying outside a building where she was handling something alone, and Dario behind him, and 4 of the security team at various stations along the hall. Kael looked at her face before anything else, the inventory taking less than a second, and then looked at the closed library door. "He's making a call," she said. "Federal contact. He wants to come in formally." She looked at Dario. "Make sure the terms he gets are the ones that keep him talking about Bellucci for the next 3 years. The information he has is worth more active than it is in a cell." Dario looked at her, then at Kyle, then back at her with the expression of a man who had been evaluating the people around him for a long time and had just updated a file. "I'll handle it," he said. Kyle said nothing. He was looking at her with the expression she'd catalogued as the most unguarded version of his face, the one that appeared in the specific moments when whatever he was managing stopped being manageable. And she looked back at him and said, "Maria and Lynn are outside. Make sure someone's with them," because the practical things needed to be done before the other things. He turned to one of the security team. "Get them to the west sitting room. Get them whatever they need." He turned back. She said, "The foyer. Let's clear the foyer first." He walked beside her back through the corridor to the foyer, the same foyer where it had started 5 months ago, with a vase and a loose strand of silver garland and a man in charcoal deciding that the piece of porcelain was worth more than the person who'd broken it. The foyer looked different now, which was partly the damaged lighting and partly the aftermath of the morning and partly the fact that she was not the person she'd been standing in it the first time. And neither was he, standing beside her. She looked up at the balustrade. The last piece of garland was still there. "I never finished decorating," she said. He followed her gaze. "Christmas was a month ago. Someone should take it down." "Tomorrow," he said. She looked at him. He was close enough that she had to look up slightly. The same geometry as the mountain house, as the library that night months ago, as every version of this specific physical arrangement they'd arrived at over and over without either of them naming what they were doing. "It's over," she said. "Most of it." He looked at the garland, then at her. "Victor's in federal custody. My legal team filed the papers at 4 o'clock. Dario has Crest contained, and if he cooperates with the federal contact, the exposure from the documents is manageable. It'll be a year of lawyers, and I'll come out the other side with a smaller operation and a cleaner one." He paused. "Bellucci is a separate problem for a longer timeline, but he's exposed. The council moved against him. His allies are pulling back. A year of lawyers," she said. "Minimum. And the organization changes," he said. "More than I planned. Faster than I planned." He said it without the tone of a man mourning it, which told her something. The federal filing, to make it work, to make the pre-tenure documents unactionable, we had to disclose a significant portion of the current structure, which means accelerating the dismantling. Things I'd planned to take 6 more years I'll need to do in 2. She was quiet for a moment. "Is that manageable?" "With the right people," he said. "Yes." She understood the weight he put on those 4 words. "I'm finishing my business administration degree," she said. "I know. 18 months if I double the course load. I know. After that, I want a real title and a real salary and a real scope of work. Not," she searched for the word, "not decorative. Not something that exists because of what we are to each other, something that I built." He looked at her with the expression of a man who had spent a long time in rooms with people who wanted things from him and who recognized in this moment the specific quality of wanting something different, not his power, not his protection, not the reflected weight of what his name could carry. Just room. Just the thing she'd build if the room existed. "The estate's legitimate holding company," he said, "the real estate arm. It manages 14 properties, and it's been running at about 60% of its potential because it hasn't had a real operations manager in 3 years, just a series of consultants who didn't stay." He paused. "It's yours if you want it. 18 months from now, when you're ready. Real title, real salary, real scope." She looked at him. "That's not charity," she said. It wasn't a question. She was checking. "No," he said. "It's the most self-interested offer I've made in a year. You tracked an 8-year financial deception through an invoice discrepancy on a tablet in a mountain house in 4 hours. You negotiated a hostage situation with no training and came out with everyone intact and Crest cooperating. You know this household's operational structure better than anyone who's worked here in the last decade." He held her gaze. "It's not charity. It's correctly allocating a resource. You're describing me as a resource." "I'm describing you," he said, "with the most accurate language I have, which I admit is not the best available. What I mean is, I know what you mean, she said. The foyer was quiet around them. From somewhere in the house, she could hear low voices. Dario's team, the kitchen staff moving, the specific sound of a household that has been through something and is beginning the process of figuring out what it is now. Outside, the estate grounds held their dark stillness. The April night with its particular cold that was not the blizzard cold, not the killing cold, just weather. Just a night. She reached up and took down the last piece of silver garland from the balustrade. She held it for a moment. This thin, inexpensive thing that had started everything, that a loose strand of it had caught her foot on a night in December and sent her out into a storm that would have ended her if a man who noticed she was absent had not walked into it. She was aware of its lightness. Everything that had followed from it felt disproportionate to what it was in her hands. Cheap, mass-produced, the kind of thing you could replace at any drugstore. But that was the nature of the moments that changed things. They were never proportionate to what they started. She looked at Kael. He was watching her with his hands at his sides, and his expression doing the thing it did when he was not managing it. Fully present, carrying what it carried without the container of professional distance. She put the garland on the hall table. She took the 2 steps that closed the distance between them. She put her hand against the side of his face, her palm against the jaw that was always slightly tight. The jaw she'd watched manage its tension across months of morning coffee and late evenings and crises and boardrooms, and the one night in a mountain house when everything came down to whether she was in the car or out of it. And she felt him go still under her hand, the particular stillness of something that has been braced for a long time and has, carefully, stopped. You were going to give up the council proceeding, she said, if Crest had held to his terms, if it had actually come down to a choice. He didn't answer immediately. I know what you would have chosen, she said. I'm not asking you to confirm it. I'm telling you that I know. Leora. Her name in his voice was the way it had been in the car at the gate, too small for what it was carrying, doing its best. The operation, she said. You would have handed me over and lost the council proceeding rather than let Bellucci's people have access to me. I know that. He looked at her. I would have found another way, he said. I don't. Kael. She said it gently. I know. You don't have to protect me from knowing. The foyer held its breath. Outside, April did its thing, the slow, patient work of a season arriving, temperatures that were cold but not killing, ground that was beginning to remember what it was under the frost. Through the tall windows, the estate grounds were dark and quiet, the storm of the day settling into what days become when they're over. He put his hand over hers where it rested against his jaw. He said, I spent a long time building something I thought didn't have any weaknesses. I know. And then you came in and brought coffee at exactly the right distance, and I should have... He stopped. You should have what? I should have been more careful, he said, which was the kind of thing a man said when he meant the opposite. She looked at him for a long moment. No, she said. You shouldn't have. This time there was nothing that interrupted them. What happened was quiet. Quieter than everything that had preceded it. Quieter than the blizzard and the attack and the library and the mountain house and the long year of morning coffee placed in exactly the right position. It was the specific quality of something that had been earned rather than arrived at, that had its weight in everything that had happened before it, and could not have existed without any of it. The months afterward moved at their own pace. The lawyers were a year, as predicted, and then some. The dismantling of the older structures, the pieces his father had built on which Kael had spent 6 years trying to build over, and which the federal filing had required him to expose and surrender more quickly than planned, happened in stages, each one managed, none of them easy. There was a period in the late summer when the pressure of it accumulated into something that filled the house with a specific quality of tension, the way a low-pressure system fills a valley before rain, and Leora learned in that period what it meant to be alongside someone through the weight of their own choices, rather than simply in their life when the weight was manageable. She stayed. She doubled her course load. She was up at 6 most mornings with the laptop before the household was fully awake, textbooks dog-eared in her specific way, corners turned down rather than bookmarked, which she acknowledged was a character flaw and had no intention of correcting. She took on 3 projects for the estate's operational overhaul that were technically outside her current scope, and managed them with the same methodical attention she'd brought to the heating invoices. And in December, the estate's external accounting firm sent a report to Kyle, noting that operational costs for the fourth quarter were the lowest they'd been in 9 years. He showed her the report over morning coffee. She read it and said, "The February numbers will be better." He said, "I know." She gave him back the report and drank her coffee. Maria moved into the estate manager role with the thoroughness of a woman who had been waiting for the scope and had spent 9 years preparing for it without knowing that was what she was doing. She ran the household with warmth and with the particular firmness of someone who had watched what fear-based management produced and had no interest in replicating any part of it. She hired 2 new kitchen staff members and a groundskeeper who turned out to be excellent and argumentative in a way that everyone in the household eventually found indispensable. And by spring, the estate had a quality it had not had in the years Leora had known it. Not the efficient perfection Victor had enforced, which was the perfection of a held breath, but something looser and realer, the quality of a house where people were not afraid to be seen making an error. Victor was sentenced in February. The federal prosecutor's case ran on the charges Dario's team had compiled: attempted murder, conspiracy, kidnapping, organized crime association, and 3 counts related to the attack coordination. The sentencing was conducted in a courtroom Leora did not attend. She read the coverage the following morning at 6 o'clock with her coffee, read the number of years and closed the tab, and opened her business administration coursework, and did not spend time on what she felt about it, because she had decided in advance that she was not going to spend time on what she felt about it, which was its own kind of resolution. Raymond Crest cooperated with federal authorities for 14 months. The information he provided about Bellucci's organization, 8 years of structural intelligence, the architecture of the placement network, the names and connections that Bellucci had spent 2 decades building, proved to be, as Leora had assessed in the library, worth more active than it was in a cell. Crest was given terms that reflected this. She did not think the terms were just. She thought they were correct, which was not the same thing, and she had learned enough about the world by now to hold both truths at once without requiring them to reconcile. Stefano Bellucci was indicted in the spring of the following year on 18 federal counts, the majority of which traced back to the information Crest had provided. The council had already moved to suspend his seat permanently. Without the protection of organizational standing, the indictment held. He did not walk free from it. Christmas came back to the estate the way it always does. Not announced, just arriving, the calendar turning to December, and with it the cold and the particular quality of light that the Hudson Valley held in winter, the sky low and white and patient above the property. The chandeliers went up first, Maria overseeing it with the precision of someone who had managed this operation many times and knew where the complications were. The garlands came next, the real ones this time, fresh pine, the smell of them filling the foyer in a way that was specific to this season and this house. Leora was on the main staircase with the silver tinsel, the same kind, inexpensive, mass-produced, the kind that caught on things. When Kyle came through the front door at 4 in the afternoon, having come back from the city a day earlier than planned, she looked down at him from the staircase. He looked up at her from the foyer. "The tinsel," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm being careful." "I can see that." She finished the section she was working on and came down the stairs, the reel of tinsel in her hand, and he was standing at the base of them watching her come with the expression she'd catalogued as the one she liked best. Fully present, not managing anything, just looking at her. "Day early," she said. "The meeting finished early." A pause. "I wanted to be here." She reached the bottom stair and was at eye level with him for once, and she looked at him directly. "Good," she said. A year had done what years do. Settled certain things, opened others, created the specific texture of a shared life that can't be manufactured or rushed, that is made of morning coffee and accounting reports and difficult seasons and the long, slow work of learning what someone is when the emergency is past, and the thing that remains is the ordinary day. She knew his sleep schedule and the specific way tension accumulated in his jaw before a difficult meeting and what his silence meant when it was different from his other silences. He knew her course schedule in the dog-eared books and the fact that she was always cold at night and had remedied this unilaterally by acquiring what could only be described as an architectural quantity of blankets. He knew that she still had the photograph of her parents on the shelf above the bed. The same shelf, the same photograph, the paper envelope she'd thought about in the snow now replaced with a proper frame, her mother's laugh caught in it forever, her father's arm around her mother's shoulders, the off-frame thing making her mother's face do the thing it did. He'd asked about them once, quietly, on an evening in the library. She'd told him. The accident, the 3 years, the foster care system, the aging out, the scramble, the estate job. She'd told it without drama because it was her life and it was hers to carry, and she'd been carrying it long enough that she knew its weight. He'd listened without performing sympathy. Then he'd said, "You came out of all that and you still trusted someone enough to go get your coat from the dry cleaner." She'd laughed, which had surprised them both. "The coat is a whole thing," she'd said. "Tell me." She'd told him. The coat, the dry cleaner, the 3 days between drop-off and the storm, the plan to pick it up that had been interrupted by a vase and a loose strand of silver garland and every subsequent event. He'd listened with the expression of a man assembling a sequence he hadn't had before. "I'll buy you a coat," he'd said. "I bought my own coat," she'd said, "in January. It's very warm." "Good," he'd said, and that had been that. Now, standing at the base of the main staircase with the tinsel in her hand and the foyer holding its Christmas smell and the chandeliers throwing light across the marble floor, she looked at the man in front of her and thought about the distance between that night and this one. The full distance, every piece of it, the blizzard and the pine tree and the chair beside the bed and the library and the mountain house and the car door and the foyer and all the mornings that had accumulated between. Cale reached into his jacket pocket. She looked at what he brought out. It was a small box, the kind whose purpose is unambiguous, navy blue, sitting in his palm with the weight of something that had been carried around for longer than its emergence today indicated. He looked at it for a moment, and then at her, and his expression had the quality of a man who was rarely uncertain about anything and who had arrived, here, at the specific edge of something he was not certain of, and who had decided to stand at the edge anyway. "I've been carrying that for 6 weeks, she said. He looked at her. "How did you had a different weight in your jacket pocket for 6 weeks, she said. "I noticed." He exhaled in the specific way of a man who had been caught at something and was not entirely displeased about it. Then he opened the box. The ring was sapphire, deep blue, set simply, not overstated, the kind chosen by someone who had paid attention to what she actually wore and what she actually liked rather than what the category suggested. He went down on one knee on the marble floor of the foyer, where a vase had shattered on Christmas Eve a year ago. "The worst night of my life," he said, "started because I noticed you were gone." He looked up at her. "The best version of my life starts because you came back." She looked at him. This complicated, difficult, not simple man kneeling in the foyer of his own house, with a ring box open and his expression carrying everything he was, and was not, and had been, and was becoming. And she felt the specific fullness of a moment that is exactly what it is, no more, and nothing missing. "You're going to wrinkle your suit," she said. "I don't care about the suit," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I'll say yes." She held out her hand. He put the ring on her finger, the sapphire sitting against her skin in the light from the chandeliers, and he stood. And she was already moving toward him when he was already moving toward her, and this time there was nothing that interrupted them. Outside the mansion windows, the first snow of the new winter was beginning to fall. Not the violence of the blizzard that had started everything, nothing like that. Just the quiet accumulation of the ordinary kind, the kind that covers the grounds and settles on the ancient pine tree and makes the world briefly still and white and without the shape of any particular disaster. The house held its warmth, the chandeliers threw their light. Somewhere in the kitchen, Maria was telling someone, probably the argumentative groundskeeper, who had ended up at the dinner table 3 times this week, because Maria had decided this was acceptable. A story that involved a lot of hand gestures and at least one laugh that carried through the closed kitchen door and down the corridor and into the foyer where 2 people stood without letting go of each other. The snow came down. The garlands held their green. The year turned toward whatever it was going to be, carrying its people with it the way years do, without asking, without mercy, without the option to stay where you were, but carrying them together, which was the thing. The only thing that had ever made the carrying survivable. The vase that had started it all was gone. The marble where it had shattered was the same marble, clean and unmarked, as if nothing had happened here. But something had happened here. Everything had happened here. And the house remembered.